I mentioned Suzanne Rouvier at the beginning of this book. I had known her for 10 or 12 years, and at the date which I have now reached, she must have been not far from 40. She was not beautiful. In fact, she was rather ugly. She was tall for a French woman, with a short body, long legs, and long arms, and she held herself gawkily, as though she didn't know how to cope with the lengths of her limbs. The color of her hair changed according to her whim, but most often it was a reddish brown. She had a small, square face with prominent cheekbones, vividly rouged, and a large mouth with heavily painted lips. None of this sounds attractive, but it was. It is true that she had good skin, strong white teeth, and big, vividly blue eyes. They were her best feature, and she made the most of them by painting her eyelashes and her eyelids. She had a shrewd, roving, friendly look, and she combined great good nature with a proper degree of toughness. In the life she had led, she needed to be tough. Her mother, the widow of a small official in government, had on his death returned to her native village in Anjou and lived on her pension. And when Suzanne was 15, she apprenticed her to a dressmaker in a neighboring town, which was near enough for her to be able to come home on Sundays. It was during her fortnight's holiday, when she had reached the age of 17, that she was seduced by an artist who was spending his summer in the village to paint landscape. She already knew very well that without a penny to bless herself with, her chance of marriage was remote, and when the painter, at the end of the summer, proposed taking her to Paris, she consented with alacrity. He took her to live with him in Rabbit Warren of Studios in Montmartre, and she spent a very pleasant year in his company. At the end of this, he told her that he had not sold a single canvas and could no longer afford the luxury of a mistress. She had been expecting the news for some time and was not disconcerted by it. He asked her if she wanted to go home, and when she said she didn't, told her that another painter in the same block would be glad to have her. The man he named had made a pass at her 2 or 3 times, and though she had rebuffed him, it had been with so much good humor that he was not affronted. She did not dislike him, and so accepted the proposition with placidity. It was convenient that she did not have to go to the expense of taking a taxi and transport her trunk. Her second lover, good deal older than the first, but still presentable, painted her in his every conceivable position, clothed and in the nude, and she passed 2 happy years with him. She was proud to think that with her as a model, he had made his first real success, and she showed me a reproduction cut out of an illustrated paper of the picture that had brought it about. It had been purchased by an American gallery. It was a nude, life-sized, and she was lying in something of the same position as Manet's Olympe. The artist had been quick to see that there was something modern and amusing in her proportions, and fining down her thin body to emaciation, he had elongated her long legs and arms. He had emphasized her high cheekbones and made her blue eyes extravagantly large. From the reproduction, I naturally could not tell what the color was like, but I was sensible of the elegance of the design. The picture brought him sufficient notoriety to enable him to marry an admiring widow with money, and Suzanne, well aware that man had to think of his future, accepted the rupture of their cordial relations without acrimony. For now, she knew her value. She liked the artistic life. It amused her to pose, and After the day's work was over, she found it pleasant to go to the cafe and sit with the painters, their wives and mistresses, while they discussed art, revealed dealers, and told body stories. On this occasion, having seen the break coming, she had made her plans. She picked out a young man who was unattached and who she thought had talent. She chose her opportunity when he was alone at the cafe, explained the circumstances, and without further preamble suggested that they should live together. I'm 20 and a good housekeeper. I'll save you money there, and I'll save you the expense of a model. Look at your shirt, it's a disgrace, and your studio is a mess. You want a woman to look after you? He knew she was a good sort. He was amused at her proposal, and she saw he was inclined to accept. After all, there's no harm in trying, she said. If it doesn't work, we shall neither of us be worse off than we are now. He was a non-representative artist, and he painted portraits of her in squares and oblongs. He painted her with one eye and no mouth. He painted her as a geometrical arrangement in black and brown and gray. He painted her in a crisscross of lines through which you vaguely saw a human face. She stayed with him for 1.5 years and left him of her own accord. Why? I asked her. Didn't you like him? Yes, he was a nice boy. I didn't think he was getting any further. He was repeating himself. She found no difficulty in discovering a successor. She remained faithful to artists. I've always been in painting, she said. I was with a sculptor for 6 months, but I don't know why. It said nothing to me. She was pleased to think that she had never separated from a lover with unpleasantness. She was not only a good model, but a good housewife. She loved working about the studio she happened for a while to be living in, and took pride in keeping it apple pie order. She was a good cook and could turn out a tasty meal at the smallest possible cost. She mended her lover's socks and sewed buttons on their shirts. I never saw why, because a man was an artist, he shouldn't be neat and tidy. She only had one failure. This was a young Englishman who had more money than anyone she had known before, and he had a car. But it didn't last long, she said. He used to get drunk, and then he was tiresome. I wouldn't have minded that if he'd been a good painter, but my dear, it was grotesque. I told him I was going to leave him, and he began to cry. He said he loved me. My poor friend. I said to him, whether you love me or not isn't of the smallest consequence. What is of consequence is that you have no talent. Return to your own country and go into the grocery business. That's all you're fit for. What did he say to that? I asked. He flew into a passion, told me to get out. But it was good advice I gave him, you know. I hoped it was. It wasn't a bad fellow, only a bad artist. Common sense and good nature will do a lot to make the pilgrimage of life not too difficult to a light woman. But the profession Suzanne had adopted had its ups and downs like any other. There was a Scandinavian, for instance. She was so imprudent as to fall in love with him. He was a god, my dear, she told me. He was immensely tall as the Eiffel Tower, with great broad shoulders and a magnificent chest, a waist that you could almost put your hands around, a belly flat, but flat like the palm of my hand, and muscles like a professional athlete's. He had golden, wavy hair and a skin of honey, and he didn't paint badly. I liked his brushwork. It was bold and dashing, and he had a rich, vivid palette. She made up her mind to have a child by him. It was against it, but she told him she would take the responsibility. He liked it well enough when it was born. Oh, such a lovely baby, rosy, fair-haired, and blue-eyed like her papa, It was a girl. Suzanne lived with him for 3 years. He was a little stupid, and sometimes he bored me, but he was very sweet and so beautiful that I didn't really mind. Then he got a telegram from Sweden to say his father was dying and he must come back at once. He promised to return, but she had a premonition that he never would. He left her all the money he had. She didn't hear from him for a month, and then she got a letter from him saying that his father had died, leaving his affairs in confusion, and that he felt it his duty to remain by his mother to go into the lumber business. He enclosed a draft for 10,000 francs. Suzanne was not the woman to give way to despair. She came to the conclusion very quickly that a child would hamper her activities. So she took the baby girl down to her mother's and left her along with the 10,000 francs in her care. It was heart-rending. I adored that child. But in life, one has to be practical. What happened then? I asked. Oh, I got along. I found a friend. But then came her typhoid. She always spoke of it as my typhoid, as a millionaire might speak of my place at Palm Beach or my grouse moor. She nearly died of it and was in the hospital for 3 months. When she left, she was nothing but skin and bone, as weak as a rat, and so nervous that she could do nothing but cry. She wasn't much use to anyone then. She wasn't strong enough to pose, and she had very little money. Ooh la la, she said. I passed through some hard times. Luckily I had good friends, but you know what artists are. It's a struggle for them to make both ends meet. Anyway, I was never a pretty woman. I had something, of course, but I wasn't 20 anymore. Then I ran into the cubist I'd been with. He'd been married and divorced since we lived together, had given up cubism and become a surrealist. He thought he could use me and said he was lonely. He said he'd give me board and lodging, and I promise you I was glad to accept. Susan stayed with him till she met her manufacturer. The manufacturer was brought to the studio by a friend on the chance that he might buy one of the ex-cubist's pictures, and Suzanne, anxious to effect a sale, set herself out to be as agreeable to him as she knew how. She could not make up his mind to buy on the spur of the moment, but said he would like to come and see the pictures again. He did, a fortnight later, and this time she received the impression that he had come to see her rather than the works of art. When he left, still without buying, he pressed her hand with unnecessary warmth. Next day, the friend who had brought him waylaid her when she was on her way to the market to buy the day's provisions, and told her that the manufacturer had taken a fancy to her and wanted to know if she would dine with him next time he came to Paris, because he had proposition to make her. What does he see in me, do you suppose? She asked. He's an amateur of modern art. He's seen portraits of you. You intrigue him. He's a provincial and a businessman. You represent Paris to him. Art, romance, everything that he misses in Lily. Has he money? She asked in her sensible way. Plenty. Well, I'll dine with him. There's no harm hearing what he's got to say. He took her to Maxim's, which impressed her. She had dressed very quietly, and she felt, as she looked at the woman around her, that she could pass very well for a respectable married woman. He ordered a bottle of champagne, and this persuaded her that he was a gentleman. When they came to coffee, he put his proposition before her. She thought it very handsome. He told her that he came to Paris regularly, once a fortnight, to attend a board meeting, and it was tiresome in the evening to dine alone, and if he felt the need of feminine society, to go to a brothel. Being a married man with 2 children, he thought that unsatisfactory arrangement for a man in his position. Their common friend had told him all about her, and he knew she was a woman of discretion. He was no longer young and had no wish to get entangled with a giddy girl. He was something of a collector of the modern school and had her connections with it was sympathetic to him. He then came down to brass tacks. He was prepared to take an apartment for her and furnish it and provide her with an income of 2,000 francs a month. In return for this, he wished to enjoy her company for one night every 14 days. Suzanne had never had the spending of so much money in her life, and she quickly reckoned that on such a sum she could not only live and dress as such an advancement in the world evidently demanded, but provide for her daughter and put away something for a rainy day. But she hesitated for a moment. She had always been in painting, as she put it, and there was no doubt in her mind that it was come down to the mistress of a businessman. "You can take it or leave it," he said. He was not repulsive to her, and the rosette of his Legion of Honor and his buttonhole proved that he was a man of distinction. She smiled. "I'll take it," she replied.